It has been 28 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. Now, the objective of the commission was to promote reconciliation and forgiveness among perpetrators and victims of apartheid who suffered gross human rights violations between March 1960 and May 1994. To reflect on what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has achieved over the years, we are joined in studio by Thapelo Mokushane, who is the Deputy Director of Stakeholder, Information and Research at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission unit in the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Good morning, Leon, and thanks for having me.
So the TRC conducted more than, I'm going to read the stats, 2,500 hearings, listened to approximately 21,000 victims, with 2,000 of those victims sharing their narratives in public sessions. This process in our country, did it achieve what it wanted to, and how vital was it at the time?
To a certain extent, yes, it did achieve the purpose for which it was intended. Let me indicate that when the TRC was established in promotion, in line with the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act number 34 of 1995, it was mandated to investigate atrocities that had occurred in this country between March 1960 to the 10th of May 1994. The TRC existed briefly as a transitional justice mechanism to assist us to move away from our deeply divided past to be where we are today, enjoying this freedom during this democratic dispensation. It also afforded a very important platform for victims of apartheid to come forward and testify about what happened to them. For the first time, witnesses who were victims of apartheid used that platform to say, this is how we're subjected, how our loved ones were killed. For instance, the first witness to appear before the TRC was Mrs. Nohle Mohapi from the Eastern Cape in connection with the disappearance, arrest and death of her husband, Mapetla Mohapi, in police custody. Yeah. So that's how it started. It was a very significant step in our history.
Indeed it was. But let's fast forward a little bit. And Advocate Dumisani Sibeza was appointed by the NPA to take a look at the TRC and the effectiveness of particularly some of the findings and what needed to be instituted at the time. And these were findings in 2019. There was found to be some political interference with the work of the TRC prosecutions, and it related to matters between 2003 and 2017. Have the reports and recommendations been implemented?
Indeed, we have successfully implemented recommendations of the TRC. Prosecution is one of them. Prosecuting the victims is one way of implementing some of those recommendations. But it's important to say, how did Parliament and government respond to recommendations that have been made by the TRC? One, the TRC recommended payment of individual reparations to victims. So a 30,000 amount once off was payable to all those who were accorded victim status following their appearance before the TRC. The second category of recommendations which was approved speaks to the erection of appropriate symbols and monuments to exalt all those who have contributed in the liberation struggle of this country between 1960 and 1994. Thirdly, we are also speaking about provision of appropriate medical benefits and other forms of social assistance. Now, let me talk numbers briefly since we do not have time. As I'm talking to you now, through the TRC bursary programs, those victims or their dependents who are listed in the TRC database, we have assisted through this TRC bursary more than 8,000 of them to attain basic education, starting from grade R up to grade 12. For those who attained higher education, we assisted just about 2,000 of them. That speaks to numbers. Thirdly, we also have a symbolic reparation in the form of exhumations. You may be aware that the TRC received approximately a list of 500 people who were reported missing to the TRC. There's a special unit located within the National Prosecuting Authority called the Missing Persons Task Team. Together, We are exhuming all those who are reported missing, who are dead, and when their remains are handed over, that is done by the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, and then for subsequent reburial by their families.
Yeah, it's taking a very long time, though, because those families are still struggling to find closure. Those families are still waiting for those remains. All of these years later, the TRC happened a while ago. Some called it a futile process. You know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And with many people waiting, saying that it's too slow, it's taken too long. In fact, you see so many people and so many families sitting in courts trying to find justice, taking it upon themselves to find justice, and those that are accused of wrongdoing are dying in the process. We're talking about prisoners. You know many of these cases that are before the law. How has this managed to reach this distance without giving these families closure?
It is definitely not a question of deliberate delay that we put in place. We had to put processes in place. For instance, implementation of TRC recommendations takes effect through applicable regulations. We had to put regulations in place that allows us to effectively implement all those recommendations. To start with, the first TRC report was handed over on the 29th of October 1998 to the former President Nelson Mandela. The TRC was still in session then. So the first report, consisting of volumes 1 to 5, was only in 1998, and volume 5 contained all the recommendations. And then the subsequent report, 6 and 7, were handed over in 2003. That was only then that the former President Thabo Mbeki tabled the TRC report on the 15th of April 2003 in Parliament. The Parliament responded by constituting ad hoc committee that considered all the recommendations. That is why we exist as the TRC unit located within the Department of Justice to ensure that all those recommendations are being effectively implemented. It was never a question of intended delays.
But then why are there delays? I mean, there are families that, we've witnessed this over the years from the NPA, requests from families and civil organizations to reopen inquests into the deaths of certain individuals. And these have taken so long. And this is a very crucial process for institutional memory, and as we keep mentioning, for these families and for the closure. And this is what was meant to happen in the first place. Why the delays? And as I mentioned, the perpetrators in this process have died.
Yes, of course, let us accept with the passage of time, some lost their lives. But I wonder, Leanne, I'm interested to know, how do you measure the delay? The issue is that we responded immediately. The first set of regulations were promulgated in 2003 to ensure that the urgent interim reparations that were recommended were paid. Immediately
how many
thereafter.
have been paid? That's a quick, important question.
Almost all of them, all those that we could trace. Remember, the TRC obtained statements from 20,000 victims. That does not mean all of them were accorded victim status. Some of those whose testimony was submitted to the TRC had to be corroborated. And to a certain extent, there was a negative finding, but most, there was a positive finding. So we have less than 10 of those who have not paid because they are no longer traceable.
1,990, well, no, not 1,000, 19,990 people have been paid. When you're talking about all of those submissions and all of the total number of people, only 10 people who are not found and not paid. Is that correct?
Yes, what I have on our stats is that less than 10 people cannot be found. But remember, some are no longer traceable, all right? The TRC was a long process. And we had, like I said, we had to put processes in place in the form of regulations to ensure that when we start to implement, we do it effectively, thoroughly, and we leave no one behind. Yes.
Finally, and we literally have 1 minute for this. It's 28 years on. The whole aim behind all of this would be to heal parts of apartheid and the wounds that have been created by apartheid. Many look to today and say, those wounds are still wide open and there has been no healing amongst so many people. What is your response to that?
Healing is a process. Remember, the TRC granted the victims that platform. For the first time, many victims were affected by atrocities that occurred during the TRC, rather the apartheid era. They did not know what had happened to their loved ones. The inquests that were conducted before 1994 held no one accountable. But at least today we know that through the TRC process, when the amnesty applicants were using that platform to apply for amnesty, they had to ensure that they reveal the truth, because it was one of the requirements of the TRC. 2, they also had to do full disclosure in respect of what they committed. 3, they also had to indicate or to show that whatever they did was politically motivated and it happened between 1960 and 1994. All that, when they were applying for amnesty, at least while majority of the victims who were listening, they were able to find the truth. So that is why we are also having a situation now whereby prosecutions are to take place, because it was also recommended that those who did not appear before the TRC perpetrators should be prosecuted. Those who were denied amnesty should be prosecuted. As I'm talking to you now, a set of investigators together with prosecutors has been assembled by the National Prosecuting Authority to demonstrate that all the atrocities that were committed during apartheid are going to be prosecuted accordingly, regardless of when they happened and regardless of who committed them.
All right, we leave it there. So, talking to us this morning, Thapelo Mokushane is the Deputy Director of Stakeholder Information and Research at the TRC unit in the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, reflecting on the 28 years since the TRC was formed. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.